we are going to do a little bit of an educated crystal ball gaze with a futurist. Our first keynote speaker is going to provide some insight into the future of platforms and how to create value in an increasingly connected world. So please welcome the founder of Advanced Human Technologies and leading futurist, Ross Dawson.
Platforms. It's a word you've heard quite a bit yesterday. It's the world that you live in. But what we're seeing is that platforms are in fact becoming central to the entire economy. So what I want to do this morning is to look beyond the world of payments, look at the whole world of platforms and how that is becoming increasingly central to our world. And as a result, the opportunities for the payments industry, and to be able to, the insights which you already understand around platforms, how those can be applied to be able to build your organizations and your success moving forward. So if we look at the first platform in the world, dates from 610 BC, the trite coin, gold and silver alloy from the kingdom of Lydia, from what is now current-day Turkey. And it meets all of the definitions of a platform. It provides a medium of exchange. It enabled commerce in a way that it was never possible before. We had barter, we had other goods of medium exchange, but this was the first true coin. And this was a platform to enable payments, unleashing an extraordinary profusion of growth, spreading throughout the world to be able to enable the economy as we know it today. So payments are in fact the oldest and original platform that we know. Now fast forward to today, and 60 of the world's largest corporations make at least half of their revenue from platform markets. Now, platforms span almost every aspect of our world that we can imagine, from transport to accommodation to financial services to work. All of these are being underpinned by platforms. So what we want to look at this morning is to be able to look at this broad view of platforms, where they are today, how they have come to where they are, and some of the lessons and how those can be applied across all aspects of your organization. So we want to start by looking at what are platforms, be able to define that, understand the nature of platforms today. Look at what has enabled their growth from where payments was arguably the fundamental platform industry in the world, where now platforms have spread across every aspect of the economy. Dig into looking at platform strategy. What is the strategy for platforms? And over the last decade, there's been a lot of study to understand the fundamentals of platform strategy, a lot of insights from other industries, which I believe can now be applied in the payments industries. Look at this idea of platform extension, be able to extend from the platforms you have. And I believe that, again, payments industry and as a platform industry can now extend their platform into areas beyond that. Looking at scaling, and so we had some wonderful presentations yesterday from some startups. And this is a manifestation, the startup world, the entrepreneurial world are looking for this scalability. That is a fundamental premise of any startup, is how you scale. And indeed we'll learn that platforms can be applied to scaling industries, scaling companies, and many lessons from how we can relate and work with startups can come from that. Look at indeed how organizations are platforms and the insights from there. And finally, just looking at some insights into where this will go moving forward. So let's begin by trying to understand what a platform is today. And it is ultimately a multi-sided market, usually a two-sided market, where on one side you've got an array of producers and the other array of set of consumers who are able to transact through a common area. They're sometimes multi-sided. There's bring in other players and other participants. Usually there's a two-sided market. But there's fundamentally multi-sided markets. If we look at a definition for platforms, they enable value-creating interactions between others outside organizations. And in order to enable that, they need an infrastructure that is open, that other people can access, and they need some kind of governance or rules to be able to enable that. Now, this is all things which you well understand, but these are things where we can start to see the same patterns happening across other industries. So from looking from the broader economy perspective, we're seeing organizations start to understand or begin to grasp that their role is no longer to create products and services and to sell them. The role of every organization today is to be able to say, how can we enable others to connect and create value by interacting together? So it's in a way a fundamentally different premise to the economy than we've had from before today. So if we look at the many, many things that can be connected, from producers and consumers, products and services, information, content, reviews, money, of course, of particular interest to you, capital, intellectual property. And if we look at all of the profusion of the platforms that we have today, and their structure of these organizations is in fact the same as that of the payments industry. And this is something which is very recent. It is only in the last decade or so that we've started to see this profusion of other kinds of platforms having the same fundamental structure as the payments industry that we've had before. And one of the most fundamental dynamics, again, as you well understand, is that of the positive feedback loops, where more users creates more values for users, which feedbacks into building more users in turn. And this is what we've seen in the classic platforms we're seeing growing around you, and is obviously fundamental to, for example, cards, merchants, and the other facets of payments that we've seen, or indeed any medium of exchange. But that's where the design comes in to be able to make sure that we are creating not just more value for users, but that creates a positive feedback loop over time. And of course, we have this wonderful chart showing that the winner takes most in any platform market. You don't get an equal segmentation of market share. Because of those positive feedback loops, you move to this not winner takes all, in almost all cases, if you look at the dynamics behind the markets, but it's absolutely a winner take most markets, or potentially you can get a duopoly or a small oligopoly in those markets. So let's look at a moment, well, what has enabled this explosion where we've started to see platforms to be not just the payments industry, but expand the entire economy? First one, very obviously, is connectivity. So the payments industry was arguably the first one that took advantage of connectivity, make cable transfers for payments. We had electronic connectivity back for a large part of the last century to be able to make payments, to be able to connect, to have the digital transfers to enable that. Now, we are seeing, of course, just in the last 2 decades, we have the internet. In the last 8 years or so, the profusion of smartphones, individual connectivity to enable those connectivity. So connectivity has now been democratized, going beyond the core infrastructure we've seen with payments to be able to be enabled by everyone. We're also seeing this participation. And if we look at the degree to which social media has been taken up in New Zealand, more than half of every adult in New Zealand, or in fact, more than half of every person in New Zealand, actually. More than half of the population of New Zealand, including infants through to 100-year-olds, are using social media, are participating. There is this belief in participating and being able to be part of these networks, to make their voices heard, to be able to participate in those flows. There is now, and these technologies of integration, going back from ODI and XML through to now a whole array of new technologies of integration, are enabling these ways where that open infrastructure, which is fundamental to platforms, is being enabled. Almost all software architecture today is designed to be open, is designed to be able to this integration where every system is based on calls to distributed databases, being able to create applications that are distributed across systems, and integration, the growth of integration as a fundamental platform for software architecture is enabling that. And the other one which is absolutely critical is that data is now at the center of the entire economy. All businesses are running off data, being able to capture and use and apply that data. And data becomes one of those essentially mediums of exchange. It becomes a core aspect of value in being able to build platforms and the value which you can create from those. So we've, of course, seen very famously the rise of Uber, which has very rapidly transformed the transport industry to be valued at well over $60 billion. We're seeing that the other commonly used example, that of Airbnb, whose market capitalizations exceed that of every hotel chain in the world. So these are industries, traditional physical world industries that have been transformed by platforms. And as we've seen examples of many others just a moment ago. And I think just looking at a few of the other examples of industries that have been transformed into platform industries, firstly, and very prominently, media, where a newspaper or a broadcast organization, they had their own channel, they had their own platform. Their paper which they printed on was a platform which they could pull in, for example, classifieds or advertisements. They had their own little platform. Broadcast TV, the platform was their own channel, again, which they could buy programs, get people to pay to be able to on those programs, have advertising, they had their own channel. Now, when we move to internet protocol, where we move to the flow of things, we're seeing that in fact, Facebook and Google are essentially transforming media. The vast majority, in fact, yeah, the majority of media consumption essentially come through social media today. So we're seeing not just Facebook, very prominently, but also things like Viber, Snapchat, messaging platforms that in fact have grown far, far faster than social media platforms, and in fact have far higher usage than any of the Facebook, any of the social media platforms of today. So WeChat, Messenger, Viber, Snapchat, these are all have, well, at least 3 of those have over 1 billion users, and these are in fact platforms for media. So it's no longer a single channel, these are now across platforms. Retail is a platform. Any shopping mall, it is a platform to be able to create a physical space where you are connecting producers and consumers. The producers being all of the retailers coming in to rent in that. The consumers are the people who are choosing to come in there because there are many retailers. It is this multi-sided market. And indeed, this is an increasing transformation of retail to that space. Other aspects of finance, lending club, over 20 billion lent in peer-to-peer lending in the United States. It's had a couple of hiccups, seems to be back on track. Many financial institutions choosing to invest in lending club as opposed to lending directly to consumers, providing superior returns and risk management. So we're seeing this enablement, this way in which we're seeing platforms enabled and transforming and taking over the economy in many domains. So let's take a moment to look at strategy. And I suppose the most fundamental aspect of platform strategy is recognizing that it must be about how do you create value and more value to your users through connecting them in various ways. And I think this is the beginning of one of the insights for payments, to be able to say, what is it that we can do beyond that simple flow of money, to go beyond that, to enable value-creating transactions? What is the nature of that value? What are the ways in which we can transcend the simple element, that platform and structure of payment, to go beyond that on how to create value through connecting others? And the other key strategic element is that of scalability. So the key elements, there's 2 elements. And so again, looking beyond payments, looking at a more general perspective on the platforms today, I mean, there are 2 fundamental elements. One is that of discovery. How is it that you discover your partner or the other entity or person or organization with which you can create value? So that value-creating interaction between others requires that discovery. And also that fundamental layer of transactions. And I think in one sense, you could say, well, that is what you do. That is the payments industry. But I also believe there's a number of layers to what the payments industry can do to be able to look at the broader perspective of platforms, and not just the role of the simple transaction within the broader platform, but how that can go beyond. That, on top of the discovery and the transactions, require the elements of governance, the rules. How is it people participate? And that includes not just the simple who participates, who has access, who doesn't have access, the regarding rules, but also the issues of how is it that value is created? How is value shared if value is created between others? What are the regulations behind participation? I believe there's many lessons to look at from the broader platforms we have emerging today, and looking at some of the dynamics of participation and sharing in Uber, Airbnb, Freelancer, Upwork, and various other platforms that have very extended participation. And around that, two critical things. One is trust, which you understand fundamentally in your industry as a key enabler, but that's an aspect that can be designed into strategy. And the other is in the user experience. And what we have evidently seen, I think if we look from outside the payments industry over the last decade, I think you could pretty safely say over the last 5 years, you could argue that the key trend in payments has been to user experience, making it easier for individuals to be able to pay in various ways, making that something which is in your pocket, don't have to think about, being able to pay instantly from the devices you have in your hands. And so this user experience is fundamental to enable people to participate, to be able to create value together. So again, looking at this broader perspective, let's run through the elements of platform strategy. So starting from the fundamental principles, and let's come back and say, all right, you're already in the platform industry, but let's come back and to think from any participant in the economy as where it is you would start. So the fundamental platforms, enabling value-creating interactions, positive feedback loops. And one of the key things is encouraging external innovation. How is it created a way in which people outside can innovate on top of your platform, be able to create things in new ways that you can't? So you need to design for others to be able to take what you've done and to do new things on that. And that is enabled in various ways, providing the hooks inside. To be able to find ways to enhance what you're currently doing and to find ways to design that from the start so you can broaden the scope of participation. I think that's, and again, one of my key messages today is that looking beyond, arguably, the narrowness of payments, to be able to say you're a fundamental platform, saying how do you broaden the scope of participation and to broaden the scope of value creation across it. Next element in platform strategy is that of positioning. And there's different elements in terms of creating simple two-sided marketplaces, being able to facilitate value, aggregating containers, as we've seen, for example, in retail spaces. Fundamental question is around single owner or multiple owners. And of course, in the payments industry globally, there's many cases where we have multiple owners in the financial sector of payments platforms. And that is one of the key design elements. To what degree do you want a single owner? What are the opportunities and the challenges of multiple owners, which you're all well familiar with? And looking around the degree of participation, what are the bounds of participation? So I think arguably there are elements, again, this is things which you're well familiar with. For example, for any card platform, you need to look at what are the boundaries on the merchants you will and won't accept, usually based on credit risk, but there can be other parameters around those choices around inclusion or exclusion of your platform, how that impacts the value of the platform. And being able to look at what is the scope of your ecosystem? Where are you looking for collaborators? Where are you looking for the participants to be able to create value from that? Next element is to be able to design the platform, saying, what is the nature of value for participants? How is value created for each of those? And what are ways to be able to play with that, to extend that, to broaden that in different ways? What are the governance structures fairly clearly? What are the principles which they're founded, making those as explicit as possible? I think an interesting one in the payments industry is that of transparency and the degree to which transparency. Where are you transparent? Where are you not transparent? What is the logic behind that? What is the information availability? They're looking at the nature of the participants in the entire ecosystem which you're working with, and understanding where there can be value in providing that information exchange. There's potential for negative feedback loops. Sometimes, for example, very obvious one in terms of participants in the system that are not always fulfilling their side of the bargain, for example, and credit risk or whatever, being able to, and that can actually feed back. And we've seen some elements where some emerging payment platforms have been highly challenged when we've started to get some non-payments in the system. And these can start to feed on themselves and losing users. So again, if you get negative value for users, you lose users and you get a negative feedback loop. So ultimately, in any platform, it's either a positive feedback loop or it's a negative feedback loop. And you can actually find in payments and other systems. And so again, for example, in Airbnb, if you get tenants who are not the best possible tenants for their overnight stay and have a wild party, then that starts to create a negative feedback loop, and that's a cycle of participation. And being able to, and I think a very interesting one there is around how can you create value creation that is personalized, not just generic, the same value creation for everyone, be able to define that individually for particular platforms. So look at capabilities, and this is arguably something which you already have deeply in the industry, but for other organizations coming into that, they need to be able to understand the capabilities they need to develop to be excellent platform players in terms of to orchestrate multiple players, to facilitate these flows across industries. And conferences like this enable this to happen. To be able to manage communities. And I think this is an interesting aspect as well. Again, there is this lack of identity in payments, which of course has a lot of value. But I think that if you look at many of the other types of platforms that we have, there is in fact value in communities, people that have similar interests or profiles, and be able to pull those together. I think arguably in peer-to-peer finance, the most powerful place in peer-to-peer lending is when the communities are lending to each other. Take, for example, the alumni of a university from a particular year. You implicitly have more trust with those people than you do with a generic person of unidentified profile. You know they've gone to the same university, you've known they've gone to the same year, you may know them, you definitely have friends in common, you have probably come from a particular ethos, and that is a community which is probably far more likely to lend to each other and have trust in each other than you would with a generic profile. So you can actually start to look at the potential for community, similarity of who these people are, their interest in being able to work together. And this comes back, I would argue, again, to barter. And barter has obviously had some ups and downs over the millennia and centuries and decades. But we still have barter in place happening, and those are fundamentally community-based. And I would argue that there is the potential for barter-type systems, which are essentially payments within communities. Reputation measures, clearly a place of any emerging payments platforms. User experience, as discussed. Data gathering, fundamental. And this is a fundamental capability of every organization and platforms, is to be able to gather that data and to be able to apply and use that in new ways. And I would argue that there's many of the payments is interlaced with many other industries, and many of the other industries around you are in fact gathering data that you could have. Or arguably there's other ways around. And that flow of who has the data, how that is managed, how that is applied to create value, and I would argue it should be particularly for users, not just the participants, is fundamental. And then finally, looking at growth. So looking at be able to provide incentives for growth on both single-side and two-side markets. So what is it you can encourage people to participate? These are fundamentally two-side markets, so how is it you can draw people into those markets? Promoting participants, being able to create value for individual participants within the groups, supporting interactions, creating value, and extending the platforms, as we'll look at in a moment. So if you can see this image, you will recognize a number of the names. This is the PayPal Mafia. And these are all of the people that made a lot of money from PayPal and are now often jointly investing in and creating some of the many companies that we're familiar with, and Tesla and Facebook and Twitter and many other companies. Now, PayPal is very instructive. It was the first significant external platform for payments. And there was many lessons along the way. And I think it's very instructive to look at PayPal, which implicitly, many of the emerging payments platforms today are drawing on the lessons that were established from PayPal as a build. And I think just one of the interesting, I suppose, anecdotes from PayPal's growth was that early on the outset, it wasn't clear that they were actually ever going to be able to succeed. And what they did was be able to they offered $10 to anybody who would join the account. If you create a PayPal account, you have $10. And you can spend it however you want, you can transfer it. And that was fairly bold. At the time, they didn't have unlimited capitalization, many mean. In fact, they were fairly low capitalization at that point. So that was a risky maneuver, ultimately to offer an unlimited amount of money. Yet that wasn't the key, which started to unlock the participation, drawing people in, to actually explicitly offer value, explicitly offer money to those who would actually join and to be able to create some of those effects. Some of the other many lessons from PayPal were absolutely in terms of the reputation systems. And I think that PayPal, eBay, and so on, I would argue that they haven't been optimal in their reputation measures, but they have, in fact, provided a platform, and again, the lessons for many others and how to be able to build those moving forward. So if we look at extension and how platforms can extend in various ways, pretty obviously, it's around APIs, and we've already heard about that yesterday. And I would argue that every payment system must have an API. This just provides a schematic outline to the Stripe API. And arguably, Stripe as a payments platform is an API. That's what it is, more than anything else. And there are other elements to that, but that is what Stripe is. It is enabling others, merchants, and those who provide services to merchants, to be able to readily and easily come in to be able to access that payment system. So this is now if we characterize payments between those who have APIs and those who don't, I think it's fairly clear where that battle is going. And clearly, more and more payment systems do it. But this is just the fundamental premise. You must provide easy, ready access. And so if we look at, for example, iOS versus Android versus other mobile ecosystems that have developed along the way, the battle has been for developers. That is why people buy a phone, is because of the quality of the apps on that system. And so that has been, so the quality of your APIs and access to them is one of the key aspects in your developer outreach, and be able to get the participation of developers, create the applications, create those systems beyond that will draw on that fundamental exchange aspect, which is platforms. So blockchain, and I think we need to remember that in fact, blockchain wasn't simply the underpinning to Bitcoin. So it was the same paper that defined Bitcoin and defined blockchain. So Bitcoin is still by far the dominant payment system, but we are now starting to see blockchain as the far more important phenomenon, because now blockchain is creating far more. It is, in fact, an enabler of new platforms. Blockchain is a platform, but Bitcoin is becoming a platform on top of that. But blockchain is now creating a platform for platforms. Clearly, Ethereum, if you haven't looked at that, absolutely you should. It is a next generation of cryptocurrency, which includes the capability for smart contracts. And again, I think this is fundamentally interesting for the payments industry, where a currency, in fact, starts to embed the ability for enforceable contracts between counterparties. This brings it to an entirely broader and new level to transactions. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had the launch of Zcash, which is a completely anonymous transfer system. Bitcoin is only quasi-anonymous. Zcash is completely anonymous. You can prove that mathematically. And so this this provides whole new layers to new platforms which will emerge. So Zcash, as many of the other early cryptocurrencies, has gained massively in value, attracted speculators, investors, and is providing And we are going to see new platforms based on it. And as you well know, blockchain is also now providing a fundamental platform for many aspects of the financial securities settlement and other aspects. So it becomes an enabler of new platforms. So now in a world where everyone's looking to blockchain, you can in fact design your own platforms using the fundamental architecture and ethos behind blockchain. So this chart you're probably reasonably familiar with, the growth of alternative payment systems in China to currently to around 15 trillion yuan. Most prominently through Alipay and WeChat Pay. So these are, I think WeChat Pay is particularly interesting here, where it's becoming a truly mobile-based payment system. And what's interesting, so as I mentioned before, the messaging systems, Messenger, WeChat, Snapchat, Viber, et cetera, are transcending social media use. What is going to be one of the interesting points is the degree to which we're seeing the use of messaging as a payments platform in China move over to the West, because these are starting to become a new platform. And if we look at things like M-Pesa in Kenya, which is a complete mobile-based payment system, I think this starts to come back to thinking, well, what actually is the platform? And this is where payments, yes, is a fundamental shift in flows and money between people. But the most prominent player in M-Pesa is is the mobile the platform? Is the app the platform? Is it the series of physical outlets? Because M-Pesa is based around physical outlets where people can put in money, take out money, transfer money across the country from a conversion from cash to mobile currency. And so this creates a more complex and nuanced view of saying, well, what is the platform? And I believe that when you look at payments and what it enables as an entire economy, you need to be able to think, well, it's not just payments as a platform. We are participating in ultimately a multi-platform system. And we need to be able to think around, well, what is the platform and who could eat our lunch? Because arguably with things like WeChat Pay or M-Pesa, there are others who are coming from outside the industry that can take a very large portion of the value, which is currently in the 1.5 trillion odd revenues of the global payment industry we see today. So turning to scalability. And so we saw this startup yesterday. I just want to look at, just skim through a few points here where we're seeing money flowing into fintech. It's, we're seeing that there's value in disruption of existing financial institutions. And partly because there is value to consumers of disrupting the way in which financial services are being provided today. So billions of dollars flowing into fintech. We're seeing now any array of new incubators and startups, UBS with Level 39 and Barclays, BBVA, many ones. We're seeing many geography-based ones. Kiwi Bank has recently set up a fintech incubator, Stone and Chalk in Sydney, others in different parts around the world, because fintech is fundamentally transformative, fundamental aspect of how value is created in the economy today, because there is so much, I believe, waste in the financial system as we've seen it so far. And there's so much more potential to create consumers. There is massive potential for disruption. So the question is for the financial industry, how is it you engage? And it is often through these mechanisms. So a little framework which I use is to looking at the startup world is to be able to look at these two-by-two matrix, whether it's funded by capital or by cash flow, and whether it is your own ideas or other ideas. And the classic thing is looking for other ideas with capital. It's VC, accelerator, incubator. But you can also, we're starting to see this whole array of smaller startup things, which are providing services, using cash flow to be able to generate those. We're seeing this capital parallel entrepreneurship, where you take their own ideas and use your capital to be able to, your own capital or external capital to be able to do that. And finally, the sort of startup studios and so on, which are using their own cash flow, using their own ideas and be able to generate that. And that is becoming far more prominent in the startup ecosystem globally. But if you look at companies like Idea Lab, they set up over 100 companies over time. This is this idea of parallel entrepreneurship. How is it that you build companies at the same time? What are the mechanisms and structures behind that? So these are some of the thinking we need to be able to do, apply in how it is we engage externally with companies, but also applying that, these ways of thinking of building exponential startups can apply as well to larger organizations. And this from Salim Ismail's exponential organizations, saying there are some of the aspects we need to experiment, be able to build the interface and dashboards internally to be able to monitor this. For example, multiple companies or multiple ventures or multiple experiments you're running at the same time, and the ways in which you can scale effectively through being able to use global workforces, being able to use crowdsourcing, to be able to use algorithms and data to be able to refine things. This is the thinking, the exponential thinking, which underlies platforms moving forward. So organizations, again, are platforms in many ways. Any organization today is not just a set of people or a network of people within an organization. It is a network of people outside that organization. And as you know, and the reason why you're here is that your industry is one of networks and the connections, and the value which is created from the connections with all of your peers is what creates value. If you just sat in your own office, sitting in your own office today, you wouldn't be creating nearly as much value as through building the external networks that enable your organizations to grow. So that external focus, thinking of the organization as a platform, actually creates different perspective on the different roles in an organization. If you're in innovation, your role is to go outside, to find accelerators, to be able to work with startups, to be able to build ideas from outside organizations. If you're in finance, it is about to be able to, how is it that you measure the value created when you're creating value with others in a broader ecosystem? If you're in HR, it's to be able to not just manage your staff, but be able to manage the talent which is outside your organization. In marketing, it's how it is you bring together others to create value. The entire focus of the organization has become external. So this comes back to what I was saying. A platform shifts the entire way in which you think about business to saying we create value and then we sell it and invoice that, to saying we are an enabler of value creation. All of our focus must be outside the organization. So Jeff Bezos of Amazon, it's intrinsically a platform organization from the very outset. And he has a very interesting approach to thinking about communication inside the organization. So he says, if you are a team inside Amazon, you must expose your data. Anyone else must be able to see that. And you must communicate through these common interfaces. And you can't communicate any other way. And they must be externalizable. So if you are a marketing group or if you are a software development group, everybody must access your organization, access your data, and that must be visible from outside the organization as well. So, and in classic Jeff Bezos style, if you don't do this, you're going to be fired. But what he is creating is the nature of an organization as a platform with externalizable data where people can tie in and we can have the flows of information that enable that value creation within and beyond the organization. So looking just a few facets of where this is going. One is that across the entire economy, value creation is shifting to platforms. And that's a good thing for the payments industry where you have been there before every other industry. Cities are platforms for innovation. They create the infrastructure, they create the interfaces, they create the ability to be able to nurture innovation, and arguably nations as well. So now every city in the world is competing to be a better platform for innovation, to be able to provide the capital, to be able to provide the interface, to be able to provide the connectivity, to be able to provide the facets will enable that. Government is a platform for value creation in the economy, and I think this is a far broader shift where I believe we will start to see the role of government is not to be governments and citizens helping each other, but government enables the citizens and organizations in the country to be able to create the better society that we want. And that's a deep and fundamental shift in the nature of what government is. And I would argue that almost every retail is becoming a platform. Health, massive transformation to become a platform industry. Transport is becoming a platform industry. So we're seeing the entire economy shift to platforms. So one of the questions is how far. This is a fundamental shift to decentralization, to value creation outside structures. And as a futurist, one of the most important questions I always ask is to see a trend, I say, how far will this go? And in payments, I would argue, there's a very solid case to make that blockchain, or probably blockchain, or possibly a variation of that, could provide an extraordinary shift to completely decentralized payments. That is plausible. It is possible. You may say that's very, very, very unlikely, but it is possible. And I think you need to be looking at the future of the payments industry. You need to be able to look at how far could payments shift to a fundamentally decentralized system, and what are the elements, and how can you use your capabilities you have in understanding platforms and knowing platforms and being platforms from the outset to be able to tap the shift of platforms. And you're in an extraordinarily powerful place, not just through your position, but through your capabilities and understanding. So we've looked at the platforms and the enablers, looked at the platform strategy, the extending platforms, scalability, organizations, and future, looking at how these platforms are applied. I think two key messages. One is, the most important message is that you are a platform industry. You've been there from the start, and as the entire economy shifts, I believe that's an extraordinary opportunity. So as we shift to a future of platforms, I invite you and I expect you to be able to create an extraordinary future for yourselves and the society in New Zealand. Thank you.